at Abatable, alongside everyone else in the climate community, we've been keeping an eye on what SBTi have been saying for some time, and obviously keeping a close eye on this process as they've been revising the standard. Now that the near final draft of this is out, how do you feel about it? What's your reaction?
Yeah, so far it's been well received, at least kind of from some of the corporate conversation we've had. Two reasons. One, it certainly provides a very strong market signal for the use of carbon credits with some level of recognition tiers attached to that, which we think companies will start to be curious about and adopt in the short term, even before the mandatory phase, and particularly in preparation for achieving a leadership status. And the second, I would say, is that SBTi has certainly been welcoming feedback. It seems like they've been working quite hard on the background, trying to build some level of flexibility that cater for quite a lot of different approaches that corporates have been advocating for and certainly been using until this point. So it's good to see that level of flexibility coming into the standard with what they've issued so far. And it seems like it's a continuing conversation from here, so we'll stay tuned for what's coming after.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've spoken to some of our corporates already about this, and the main piece of feedback that we received was that it's going to be a lot easier to sell the business case internally in terms of why they should be investing in carbon credits, why they should be engaging with the DCM, and also whether they should set an internal carbon price. We've heard that this direction and this labelling system from the SBTi is really going to be positive for sustainability teams, which is what we like to hear.
The corporate net zero standard has been in existence since 2021. SBTi are now in the phase of consulting and finalising the changes to the new version 2 of the standard. And over this process and before, they've had a lot of feedback on the role of carbon credits and how they should be used as part of the corporate net zero standard. What does the new standard say here, and how does it address how carbon credits can be used in net zero strategies?
Yeah, so I think it's quite a significant evolution from SBTi. So in the previous version 1 of the standard, carbon credits had 2 roles. They could either be used as carbon removals at the point of net zero. So for most companies, that would be 2050. And SBTi said that companies could use carbon removal credits to neutralize around 10% of their residual emissions. So a company reduces their scope 1, 2, and 3 to 10% of what it was at the baseline, and then that 10% is neutralized with carbon removal credits. Mm-hmm. The second role for carbon credits was as beyond value chain mitigation. So beyond value chain mitigation didn't count towards SBTi targets. It was simply an extra that companies could kind of opt in to do. BVCM included carbon credits, but it also included things like climate finance or adaptation funding. What SBTi have done with this new guidance is bring those 2 concepts together. A lot of stakeholders suggested that waiting to 2050 to start procuring carbon removals would mean that the carbon removals market didn't have enough time to build supply and scale, and then it might be a bit of a rush for carbon removal credits. And with beyond value chain mitigation, some stakeholders and companies suggested that there wasn't that much of an incentive for companies to engage with carbon credits and take responsibility or compensate for their ongoing emissions. So now SBTi have introduced the ongoing emissions responsibility framework, and this requires companies to take responsibility or compensate for a certain amount of their ongoing annual emissions, and then gradually introduce more removals so that by the time we get out to 2050, they would have built up their removals portfolio and have enough supply to neutralise their residual emissions.
And so it feels like before there was an exploration in the earlier draft of introducing interim removal targets to help build that market, and also some of the feedback on the role to address ongoing emissions. The new solution brings those 2 things together as we move out towards 2050.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot more actionable now for companies to understand what their carbon credit portfolio should look like today, and what it will look like in 2050. So while the EOR framework is voluntary at this point, in 2035 it's going to become mandatory, and there'll also be a prescribed amount of removals that should be a part of that portfolio, so that by 2050 at least 41% of your overall carbon credits are long-lived carbon removals.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the introduction of tiers within the guidance. And so companies can have can choose which of these tiers they want to go on, depending on the level of investment they want to make within carbon credits to support their climate ambitions.
Yes. So there's two tiers. The first one is recognised and the second one is leadership. So for each of these tiers, there's two areas that companies can essentially spend their budgets. The first one is mitigation impact outcomes. That is carbon credits as we know them and the VCM. And the second one is climate finance. So these are additional contributions such as adaptation finance or potentially investment in removals projects that aren't issuing credits yet, but they might down the path. So for the recognition tier, there are two options for companies. Either they take responsibility for 1% of their scope 1 to 3 emissions with carbon credits, mitigation impact outcomes, or they set an internal carbon price on 1% of their scope 1 to 3 emissions. SBTi recommends that this ICP is at $20 per tonne, but it's not required. And then once they've raised the funds from that ICP, they can spend it on climate finance initiatives. Mm-hmm. So the recognition tier is either 1% mitigation impact outcomes or 1% of your proceeds spent on climate finance.
And the leadership?
So the leadership tier is quite a big step up. You have to set an $80 per tonne internal carbon price on 100% of your scope 1 to 3 emissions. But you do have a bit more flexibility in terms of how you spend that. So you have to take responsibility for 40% of your ongoing emissions with carbon credits. And then once you've done that, you can choose to spend the rest of the proceeds on more carbon credits, or you can invest in various climate finance outcomes as well.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add is also SBTi is increasingly starting to approach any sort of transition plan from a carbon or GHG inventory perspective. This new attempt is really trying to drive companies to be focused from a GHG lens. And we see quite a lot of corporates now starting to think about, for example, biodiversity targets that don't necessarily have that same level of correspondence with the GHG components and might be better implemented through what we have now, which in the toolkit, which is the ongoing emission responsibility, as the carbon credit market has historically intersected quite a lot with biodiversity and climate impact outcomes beyond the carbon component too. So we're quite excited to be able to see how perhaps the ongoing emission recognition bucket could allow companies to also not just now be recognized in the SBTi guidance framework, but also start to be aligning increasingly to some of their very ambitious biodiversity or nature positive targets.
Sure, that's really interesting, because then you're taking the carbon credit route to fit in with SBTi. Any co-benefits from nature-based carbon credits that you're getting, there's that added benefit that you can then think about in relation to if you're involved with the Task Force on Nature-related financial disclosures or other biodiversity initiatives.
Yep, absolutely. And we're starting to see quite a lot of early adopters think about the framework that you just mentioned, which is TNFD, and how they can start thinking about integrating the understanding of ecosystem impact from a systemic perspective into their operations targets. So yeah, what we think is that most of that will come through from the perspective of carbon credit procurement as part of the ongoing emission recognition bucket.
There's a mandatory aspect of this kicking off at a certain date in the future.
Yeah, I think what is interesting about the guidance is that it allows for a voluntary period for companies to start getting up to speed on what an ongoing emission responsibility could look like. We see the first phase starting essentially in 2026, where the new guidance will be finalized, up to 2035. And from 2035 onwards, SBTi indicates that this will become mandatory, particularly for what they define to be category A companies. These tend to be the largest companies or the medium-sized organizations within high-income countries. And I think what is interesting for us is also what it means when it comes to the carbon credit outlook from a demand perspective. We see this new guidance providing a very strong demand signal from 2035 onwards. The starting point for a lot of organizations, Ollie was alluding to, has been historically the beyond value chain mitigation approach, which indicated at least 5-10% of ongoing emissions to be matched with carbon removal. So if you assume that that is the starting point, probably a lot of organizations would want to aim for a very ambitious leadership status as opposed to the recognized one. And so what is interesting is that potentially the kind of journey from the starting point up to the leadership status could also yield some short-term demand for carbon credits from here to 2035. Although, of course, that's a little bit more uncertain relative to the mandatory phase from 2035 onwards.
Sure. And the demand signal there will come from companies that want to excel at climate action, will want to become a leader under this new framework.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think on our side, we're starting to see some of the corporate engagement at Abatable with organizations wanting to align to a more ambitious climate agenda. And some of them already have internal carbon pricing as a tool in their toolkit for defining some of these ambitious ongoing responsibilities.
And on the aspect of it when it comes to removals and moving towards neutralization date, is there a split between how removals should be ramped up over time when we get beyond 2035 or even before that?
Yeah, so SBTi have said they're going to revise their standard before 2035, but we know that it's very likely that taking responsibility for ongoing emissions is going to become mandatory at that date. And also there'll have to be a certain percentage of removals. So SBTi splits out removals into short-lived removals, which they define as storing carbon between decades and centuries. So this might be our typical nature-based solutions, afforestation projects, soil carbon, etc. And then they also define long-lived removals as projects that store carbon for over 100 years. So this would be primarily tech-based solutions such as direct air capture. We don't know what the prescription is going to be in 2035, but by 2050, SBTi state that you have to neutralize 100% of your ongoing residual emissions, and 41% of that has to be long-lived removals.
And the residual emissions are obviously the ones that remain at your net zero year from hard to abate sectors, which are typically more tricky to tackle than, say, low carbon power, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I think one interesting thing about this guidance is SBTi have previously set the general baseline to be 10%. So in 2050, they expect that 10% of your residual ongoing emissions will still be there. But actually, they did not mention that number in the new revised standard. So it could be that that changes. It could be that there's new sector guidance. And again, that might not come in the second revision of this standard in about a decade's time.
Scope 3 has always been an interesting area for SBTi. How does the new framework talk about Scope 3? How does it address it?
Yeah, I think the previous guidance when it came to Scope 3 allowed for some component of within value chain mitigation activities alongside the use of carbon credit as an environmental attribute certificate, so long as there was a connection between the carbon credit activity and the value chain as part of the Scope 3 targets. The guidance now is changed in that it now defines and provides clearer boundaries as to what are Scope 3 interventions that could be mitigated. Those boundaries are predominantly linked to direct emission source, so anything that's to do with directly engaging companies' tier 1 suppliers and working with them to reduce emissions, specifically at the emission source. And they've introduced new concepts, new interventions, like, for example, an activity pool intervention that recognizes the fact that some companies have distributed sourcing regions that they work with, and have essentially emissions related to that activity pool that they're sourcing from, alongside sector level intervention, which is also another topic that they've introduced that is a little bit more kind of comprehensive, in that is sector level emissions. Some guidance there is yet to come in terms of what specifically they refer to as that. And what is interesting is that they've also stated that some of the emission linked to activity pools and sector level interventions could be mitigated by the provision of something that they call commodity EACs. So commodity EACs being commodity environmental attribute certificates.
Mm-hmm.
And what's changing from the previous draft to this draft is that carbon credits are no longer part of a commodity EAC, so they squarely are taken out of any sort of scope 3 target mitigation activities and squarely fit into what Ollie introduced before, which is carbon credit only for the use of ongoing emission responsibility.
So when you're dealing with emissions in your supply chain, there's almost a hierarchical approach from dealing with suppliers directly and working with them to reduce emissions. The next step, if that's difficult due to the nature of the supply chain, may be to use a supply shed or a factory cluster to purchase EACs in that environment to mitigate emissions intensity from a specific geographical area. If that's difficult, then it moves on to sector level. Okay.
Exactly. Correct. Yeah, it reflects exactly the prioritization of kind of engagement that we would expect companies to go through, working directly with suppliers where they have transparency into emission sources of those suppliers, if not engaging really with industry activities or even innovative market-based instruments like commodity environmental attributes for them to mitigate part of their inventory accounting as part of the scope 3 targets.
So more of a impetus to take additional action to address ongoing emissions as companies transition to net zero.
Exactly.
Thanks very much for the time, both. Really great to sit down and chat about this with you. Obviously, we're going to be keeping an eye on things as things progress. Watch this space.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Marc.